Lord, I am just a simple man, trying hard to understand. Where's my place in your great plan? Oh Lord, help this man. Lord.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to a new episode of Contemporary Fiqh Issues. We have with us again our special guest, Sheikh Asem bin Luqman al-Hakim. Sheikh Asem, welcome. Sheikh Asem is one of the well-known da'is and callers in the West. He travels extensively to many countries around the world delivering lectures, and he is the Imam and a Khatib of a masjid in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and he has been in such position for the last 21 years. Sheikh Asem, last time when we were discussing on the show, we were discussing the term fiqh al-nawazil or al-nawazil fiqhiyya, or contemporary fiqh issues, and what this means to Muslims, and how the scholars derive rulings for this issue. We also discussed looking at it from an overall point of view, and we were briefly getting into the issue of how to categorize the contemporary fiqh issues. If you could elaborate, please.
Okay, we mentioned that we have to, first of all, visualize an incident in order for us to be able to understand it. So if there is something that's contemporary, a physician would be the best person to explain it to a scholar in order for the scholar to be able to know what ruling to give. Yet this physician would not be suitable to give the verdict whether it's permissible or not permissible, because he's not equipped with the Islamic knowledge and tools of science. Likewise, if we want to talk about finance transactions, a person from the finance world would be the most suitable person to explain and elaborate on how things are going to a scholar of religion. Therefore, we have to first of all visualize it. Sometimes, without visualizing it, you give the wrong interpretations, the wrong rulings on a particular issue. For example, if we look at what is known as suicide bombing, and some would call it missions of martyrdom. They would think that if you do this, if you blow yourself up, you're a martyr. And on the other side, there are scholars that would call him a person who committed suicide. Without visualizing how this takes place, you cannot give the correct fatwa. Because the most authentic opinion is that suicide bombing is suicide. Regardless of the benefits, who is the one who pushed the button? It is you. Who is the one who pulled the trigger? It is you. So you are actually killing yourself. And in so many incidents and cases, a person kills himself without killing anyone else, or kills indiscriminately, kills children, women. And in Islam, we're obliged and we're instructed not to kill the elderly, women, or children. Only those who fight us, only warriors. So by doing this, you're actually not killing others, you're killing yourself. You're committing suicide and you're going against Islam. When a scholar gives a fatwa, if he does not look into these aspects, he would give the wrong fatwa. And that is why visualizing it is very important. After you visualize something, then you move on to categorize it. And you go to the scholar of Islam and ask him about what category does this incident fall under. And the scholar has to follow a process. First of all, he visualizes it, and then he goes on to see, does it fall under A, evidence from the Quran, Sunnah, or the consensus of scholars? For example, we gave that last time we met, example of electrocution. This falls under a dead animal, which was not...
Electrocuting the animal, yes.
Yes.
To execute them.
We as Muslims cannot eat an animal unless it is slaughtered Islamically by a Jew, Christian or Muslim, and it has to be slaughtered. So if it was killed before being slaughtered, this is considered to be a dead animal. Whether it was killed because it fell from a mountain, or it was hit on the head, or it was electrocuted, or it was suffocated, or whatever, it's still a dead meat.
So even though there's no direct ruling from the Quran or Sunnah that says if you electrocute an animal to slaughter it, this is not considered lawful slaughtering, we can devise, or the scholars can devise by the evidence that if an animal dies by any other means other than slaughtering, it's considered dead meat. So there is a direct ruling.
Exactly. This is exactly true. We can give another example for example, wearing a wig. In Islam, the Prophet told us about ﷺ, that it is forbidden for a woman to connect false hair to her own hair. But this is not connecting false hair. This is putting a whole thing on top of your head that looks like hair. So does it take the same ruling? The answer is yes, because it falls under the same evidence. And you can also talk about visualizing or sighting the moon. Because nowadays we have people saying that, can we calculate where the moon is going to appear and when the moon is going, the crescent is going to be born, instead of just visualizing it and sighting it. And the Prophet ﷺ clearly said that you have to fast once you sight it, and you have to break your fast, which is Eid, once you sight it. So this is something that was spoken for. The Prophet ﷺ already had drawn the line for us in this aspect.
But regarding contemporary issues, since there's something that fell upon the Muslims, as you explained for us in the last episode, Barakallahu Fikum, it's not something that we can directly take from the Quran and Sunnah, and something that the scholars really have to derive. So we mentioned from those issues that they have to look at, first they have to see it from an overall point of view, and they have to look at the experts for said field, what they explain. So they have to have knowledge of what they're talking about. Then we discussed briefly of how to categorize. So how would they categorize this?
Well, actually, as I said, categorizing it falls under 4 main branches. First of all, they would categorize it if there's a verse of the Quran, Sunnah, or the consensus that falls under it.
Okay.
If not, they go to type B, which is looking at an incident that took place before, which was a nazila at the time, and scholars gave fatwa on, and nowadays this incident that we have falls under the same fatwa, or is similar to it. For example, I give an example of an open buffet. Eat as much as you can. There isn't anything that covers this, but if you look in the books of fiqh, you would find that scholars gave an example of the public baths. If the consumption of water in public baths differ from one person to the other, so if someone with like a 450 pounds takes a bath, is different than someone who takes who weighs 150 pounds. So the consumption of water, of soap, of whatever is different, yet the price is the same. And likewise in open buffet, they make an average, and people might eat a lot and others might not. Yet the price is the same. So the variation of size and the consumption is negligible, as scholars say. Likewise, using loudspeakers for announcing the salah, making the adhan for the prayers, it is not mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah, but they had something known as a tabligh, which at early times they used to do because they had big and wide mosques. So in order for the sound or the voice of the imam to reach the back rows, they had to have like 4 or 5 people relaying his sound. So whenever he says Allahu Akbar, the one in the 5th row says Allahu Akbar, the one in the 10th row says Allahu Akbar, so on. So scholars said that it is permissible to use loudspeakers because it falls under the same incident, or it's similar to it. And compiling the Quran in tapes or in CDs, this is measured and compared to writing the Quran and collecting it in one mushaf as was done.
So analogy with actions of past scholars and Muslims is taken into consideration.
Yes, this is part 2.
Okay.
The third part, or the third way of looking at it, is when you have an Islamic ruling or a principle that is not the Quran and Sunnah, that had not been done before, but it's an understanding that you measure it under. And for example, making sa'i, which is going from Safa to Marwa on the second floor. Now the Prophet did it on the ground floor, and all the Muslims. Now there are lots of worshippers visiting, and it's not enough. So what is the ruling on having a second or a third or a fourth floor? Well, they say that there is a general fiqh ruling which states that the air takes the position of what's underneath it. So this means that whatever you do on the in air would have the same ruling, and this helps us even in looking at our prayers in an airplane, because some say that no, this is not permissible. Among the conditions of prayer that you have to be on the ground,
or in some of the masajid that have several floors because they're constrained by space,
and it has the same ruling. Likewise, if you look at the ruling on impersonating prophets and messengers. Now, there isn't anything that says don't do this in the Quran or the Sunnah, or anything that was looked at in the past, but it falls under the general ruling of respecting and looking up to these prophets and messengers.
We'll continue on that point inshallah in just a minute. We have to go to a break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Lord, I am just a simple man, trying hard to understand.
Our schools, what is missing? Join Dr. Mamdoor Muhammad in Our Schools, What is Missing? He will be discussing the most common mistakes made in our educational systems.
What type of teaching they teach him, what they say to him, what books they select for him to read, what things that he listens to, what games that he begins to play with.
How to perfect the work in the school.
Our goal is to improve our school.
And we'll see practical solutions from the Book of Allah and the Sunnah of His Messenger.
Most of the criteria for success for us had been designed for us by our Creator.
Our Schools, What is Missing? In Ramadan on Huda TV.
Lord, I am just a simple man, trying hard to understand.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back. Sheikh Asem, just right before the break, you were discussing the issue of sa'i. If you could continue, please, for the benefit of us.
We mentioned that there are a number of ways of looking at this, and there are 4 procedures that we should follow when we would like to know, after visualizing an incident, how to categorize it. And we said that the third one is the thing that falls under a general ruling, which is not Quran Sunnah, which is not an incident that took place in the past, but it's a general ruling or a fiqhi ruling. For example, for sa'i, the ruling states that the air takes the same ruling as the floor. This is a general ruling. Once we apply it, we understand that if I build a second or a third floor over the mas'a, where people go from Safa to Marwa, this takes the same ruling.
During Hajj and Umrah.
During Hajj and Umrah. Likewise, if I pray on the ground or if I pray on a plane, then it's the same ruling because I am in the air, and the air takes the same ruling as the ground. And also impersonating messengers and prophets of Allah. This is completely forbidden, and the consensus of scholars upon this issue, because there is a great rule that we follow, which is that known by default in Islam, that is to glorify and to, well, actually to respect the prophets and messengers of Allah Azza wa Jal, and impersonating them by any Tom, Dick or Harry is considered to be humiliating them. The fourth category is that does not fall under the first three, but usually it is looked at as form of blocking the means. So for example, if we come to the issue of organ transplants, some say it's permissible, some say it's not. Those who say it's not, they're blocking the means, because they say that you have to take this organ from a dead person, and breaking the bone of a dead person is like breaking it from a living person, like the Prophet said, is forbidden. Or mutilating a dead person, or harming a living person by taking one organ of his that may affect his life in the future. So this is one of the ways you categorize it. Now, we spoke about two types. First, you visualize, then you look at the ruling in accordance to Islamic sciences. Does this end the process? Definitely not. Why is that? Because you may know the ruling, you may know the circumstances that this incident took place in, and you understand it fully, but it still may not be applicable. And this is very important, because it's not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2. For example, a person who is ill or sick, the doctor diagnoses this illness, so he's visualizing it. Then he knows where the illness is. He goes to his own knowledge to seek the remedy or the medicine, the treatment. And he comes up with a treatment or a surgical procedure. And he knows that 1 + 1 = 2. So this is the illness and this is the procedure. We come to the third part, which is it applicable or not? There might be a reason that prevents him from applying this procedure, whether the patient is too old or the circumstances are not suitable. There isn't any operating room that is suitable or hygienic or whatever. Likewise in Sharia, the scholar comes and he visualizes and he knows under what category it falls under, but then he sees if it's applicable or not. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, he came to Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, and told her that had your people were not so close to the times of ignorance and pre-Islam times, had they not been like this, I would have demolished the Kaaba and built it all over again on the pillars of Ibrahim, and I would have made 2 doors for it, one for the people to enter from and one to exit from. What prevented the Prophet from doing this? He visualized the circumstances. He knew that he had the right to do this, but he didn't, because he understood that there were things that would prevent him from doing this. And this is very important, because to apply something, you have to have 3 criteria or 3 conditions. First of all, you have to balance between the pros and the cons, advantages and the disadvantages. Whenever the disadvantages overweigh, it's forbidden. You have to stop. Secondly, you have to evaluate the necessity and whether this is something general or specifically for A, B, or C. For example, the utilization of bank interests. If someone is living in Canada, for example, and by law they have to give him interest over his deposits in the bank, would he leave it for them so that they can utilize these interests to mercenaries and etc., or that is missionaries? Well, it's the same.
Or benefit from it by harming others, by lending it to other people, taking more money from them.
Or should I take it and give it to the poor? This is an issue of discussion that has to be thoroughly looked to. And finally, we have to understand the circumstances, the traditions, the customs of the country. As in the case of the ruling on wearing pants, trousers. So if you visualize it and you know that these trousers are the dress of non-Muslims, for example, and then you try to put it under a category which is Islamically, and look at it, whether it's permissible or not, probably would say, you know, imitating the non-Muslims is haram, is forbidden, so it's not permissible for you to wear trousers. Now, I gave the verdict without going into the third category, which is it applicable or not? The fatwa is not applicable, because though the non-Muslims wear it, the majority of Muslims wear it as well. So it is not indicating that whoever wears trousers is not a Muslim. It's shared by Muslims and non-Muslims alike.
It's not something specific to them.
Yes. So this is how the conditions that we have to have in order to know whether to apply this or not. Now, having talked about this, visualizing, knowing which category, and then is it applicable or not, there's a fourth type or fourth procedure, which is if I did not still reach a verdict. What to do after applying all this process? I could not reach a verdict. What to do? The safest and the most acceptable thing among scholars is to abstain. Just
say Allahu A'lam.
Allahu A'lam. I do not have the knowledge. Maybe someone else would come later on and give this, but you have to be aware not to go into deep waters without being able to swim.
So we find often, though, that there are some scholars that unfortunately, or people who claim to be scholars, that actually do this. They go in over their head and they end up misguiding the people as a result of it. So what would you say, Sheikhna, are some of the common mistakes that some scholars make when addressing these issues?
That's a good question. People by nature make mistakes. And that is why we do not exclude scholars from this human nature thing. However, it is very important to know that these nawazil, these incidents or new contemporary issues should not be addressed by one single scholar. It should be collective. And this is why the fiqh council of so many organizations and countries, they collaborate, they gather once or twice a year to discuss these important issues that maybe if one scholar gave his fatwa without consulting them, he would regret this later on. So the most important thing to avoid is to give a fatwa without having a reference of a collective decision-making body, which is usually composed of scholars who are excellent in their knowledge, and also they are excellent in their righteousness. Among the mistakes that a lot of or some of the scholars may fall into is dissecting an incident that they're asked about. So whenever they try to visualize an incident, they come to it and say, okay, this incident is divided into 4 contracts, for example. I'll give you an example. There is what is called as an Islamic transaction in banks, where you go, you actually want a loan. Conventional banks tell you, we will take 7%. Here's 100,000, you pay us 7% a year. Islamic banks, so-called Islamic banks, would say, well, we don't lend you by interest, but what we can do is, you give us power of attorney to buy something on your behalf. You give us a promise or a signed contract that you're going to buy it of us once we buy it for you. And then you authorize us to sell it to someone else, and then you pay it to us in installments.
So basically they're looking for like a loophole in the system. Like trying to get around it, sort of like what the children of Israel did by putting their nets ahead of time, because they weren't allowed to work on the Saturday. So they would put their things ahead of time and then collect it after Saturday.
It's exactly the same ruling. they are making a trick. The funny thing is that when a scholar comes and looks at this transaction, he dissects it, he divides it. So he says, power of attorney is permissible in Islam. Giving a promise that you will do something is permissible in Islam. Giving them the power of attorney to buy or to sell is permissible in Islam. Buying items in installments is permissible in Islam. So if you look at it individually, it's all permissible. But when you come to the actual transaction, it is something of a trick to make usury or to make riba halal.
So they forgot about إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, that every action is by their intention.
Yes, and this is extremely important in transactions, that the intention is meant, it's meant, and it is intended. So it has to be looked at when making a transaction.
Barakallahu feekum ya Sheikh, Jazakallah khairan. We'd love to continue, but unfortunately we're just out of time. Join us again next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Lord, I am just a simple man, trying hard to understand. Where's my place in your great plan? Oh Lord, help this man as time, like the grain of sand, slipping through the palm of my hands. I realize I need to make amends. Oh Lord, forgive this man, forgive this man.